Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. For those of us old enough to remember when ESPN came on the scene back in 1979, you simply knew it marked the start of something really big. All sports, all the time. Nothing like it had ever been available before. Our guest today was the very first person hired at ESPN. He was, in fact, their original executive producer, back when ESPN was simply an idea, an unproven one at that. Peter Fox helped drive that enterprise from the very beginning, and they had their challenges, as outlined in his book, The Early Days of ESPN, 300 Daydreams and Nightmares. Peter's going to be along in just a moment with his priceless, unforgettable stories. This week's trivia question: it is the most famous day from the Revolutionary War that we used to celebrate, but don't really celebrate anymore. What happened on November 25th? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer. We'll give you the topic for next week's show. The Entertainment and Sports Programming Network. Yes, that's what ESPN stands for. The concept of all sports all the time crashed into our lives with the debut broadcast on September 7th, 1979 from Bristol, Connecticut, where ESPN headquarters remain to this day. Now, at first, it struggled to attract viewers and big-time sports contracts. More often than not, you'd see some rather marginal sports being featured, things like volleyball, slow-pitch softball, wrestling, even darts, whatever it took to keep sports going non-stop every 24 hours. Well, the founder of ESPN was a guy who used to broadcast hockey games in Hartford, Bill Rasmussen. He had the idea with his son and started hiring personnel to help him implement his dream and vision. The first person he hired was the executive producer, Peter Fox. Well, Peter's our guest today, and his book, The Early Days of ESPN, 300 Daydreams and Nightmares, contains priceless anecdotes about the nail-biting deadlines and pressures to hit the self-imposed declared target to go live of September 7th, 1979. Everybody who follows ESPN knows they're based in Bristol, Connecticut, but that's not where they started. In fact, they had extremely humble roots in rented quarters in neighboring Plainville, Connecticut, at a cable TV firm on Cook Streets. There are so many stories to tell, great ones from a fabulous book about the history of ESPN. So, Peter, this is a pleasure to chat with you and to talk about something that every Connecticut resident knows about, and now everybody around the world knows about, the Entertainment and Sports Programming Network. And I got to tell you right up front, when I got your book and read, the early days of ESPN, 300 Daydreams and Nightmares, I must admit, I was scratching my head saying, I don't even know what ESPN stands for. So thank you for answering that, first of all. I honestly didn't, because nobody calls it the Entertainment and Sports Programming Network. But you have done a masterful job bringing out the history, the people who were involved, and you leave no stone unturned in terms of naming people. We won't have time for that today, of course, but I think just let people know you were the founding executive producer of ESPN. Tell us what you did and what it was like being part of bringing this to life.
Bill Rasmussen, the founder, was a golfing buddy. And he and I both had worked ourselves out of jobs one summer, the summer of 1978. He asked me if I thought all sports television would work. I was born and brought up in the eastern part of Connecticut, and so I got Boston and New York radio signals, and I cut my teeth on Red Sox, Bruins, Celtics, Knicks, Yankees, New York Giants. It was just part of me. And of course, the answer was yes. And he said, well, will you help me? And I said, yes, but Bill, I've got a family and I wish I could throw some dollars in, but if you want me to work, I got to be paid. So he said, well, when we get money, you're the first one in. And that turned out to be the truth, although Lou Palmer, the former WTIC sportscaster, and I walked in the same day, so I can't remember who held the door. So we would be employees 1 and 2. And Lou's title was director of programming, and mine was executive producer and polisher of coffee cups. So we did everything that needed to get done supporting Bill. Bill and his son Scott were the primary, I would call them the Johnny Appleseeds, who ran around the country doing things while Lou and I stayed at the 319 Cook Street United Cable Television room that we rented from them to make things work.
Now, Peter, for people who don't know Bill Rasmussen and his role in all this, could you just spend some time telling us who he was?
Well, Bill was an inveterate sportscaster who played some minor league baseball. So, he had it in his blood too. And he was the play-by-play announcer of the New England Whalers when they opened up at the Hartford Civic Center. He and I didn't know each other. And I went to him post-game and stuck my hand out and said, Bill, you and I got to know each other. I was then the president of a ad agency that I had built in Connecticut. We became fast friends, golfing buddies. We actually worked together producing radio reports from the then Sammy Davis Jr. Greater Hartford Open PGA Tour events. So we had history.
Now, one of the great stories of many in your book is when Bill Rasmussen was driving to a wedding in Ocean Grove, New Jersey. Tell us about that.
Well, as he tells it, we by that time had been turned on to the prospect of satellite. But it was a prospect of using the satellite only to deliver UConn pay-per-view sports on television to the local Connecticut cable stations. And it was then, I believe, Scott, during that traffic jam, who mused that the satellite footprint went all over America. Wouldn't we be wasting it? That's where the light bulb went off. Bill said, well, maybe we could get the NCAA to give us access to their football games. Once they said that, that just triggered a deluge of, and then we could do this, and then we could do that, and then we could do this. I guess they admit in Bill's book that they were terrible guests at that wedding because they sat in the corner with the yellow legal pad and kept doing things about what they could do with a nationwide satellite.
Now, of course, all great entrepreneurial ideas, we all have a few every day, but not many of us end up with the financing to be able to make something like this come to life. And if you could tell us briefly the story behind the unlikely suitor of ESPN, the one that got it off the ground financially, was actually from the oil industry, Getty Oil. How'd that happen?
Well, I'd like to correct that a little bit. In the very beginning, there was an angel investor, J.B. Doherty, who was a young man at what would now be called venture capitalist, and they advanced us enough money to put together a business plan and for Lou and I to do demonstration programs live that Bill could point to and say, look how good we are. And J.B. Doherty and his company also owned property in the Hawaiian Islands, a hotel resort. He was out there protecting that investment, which was also being considered by Getty Oil to develop some non-oil projects. And Doherty and the Getty Oil non-oil vice president, Stuart Evie, were having cocktails by the pool. And Doherty started talking to Evie about ESPN, and Evie was the kind of Hollywood go-go guy to whom it appealed. And he said, I'd like to know more. And that triggered Rasmussen flying out to Los Angeles with a pitch, and the rest is history.
So at one point, Getty Oil's sort of side fund for these kind of ventures owned up to, I think, 85% of ESPN. And so that gave enough money, obviously, to get the venture off the ground and to finance what needed to be done. But, great ideas, great money behind it, still wouldn't go far without the right talent. And there were some folks from NBC who got pulled into this, which seemed to be really important along the way as well. Could you tell us about Chet Simmons and Scotty Connell?
I can. First of all, there's a lot to be said for what Bill and Scott and the other Espionauts that I call us did. But one thing was for sure, we may have been in over our heads. Peter Fox, the executive producer, could not pick up the phone and talk to the commissioner of baseball. He wouldn't answer the phone. Getty Oil understood that, and they went right down to New York, and there was a political fight going on at NBC. Simmons, who was known as the father of ABC's Sports Spectacular, and he got hired by Getty Oil, and he took Scotty Connell, the genius production executive, with him, and a flotilla of their underlings that helped us put ESPN on the air.
Just to put Scotty Connell in the proper perspective in his background, he had some real highs and one very interesting, maybe you would call it a low. In the 1968 football playoff season, the movie Heidi was coming up while a game was still underway between the New York Jets and I think the Colts, the Baltimore Colts at the time. They cut away from that. They had to, I think, as I understand that. Do you have that story?
Well, I have that story related. It's basically a money story. The advertising people had sold ads in Heidi, and the CEO trickled down all the way to the production room and told Scotty he had to switch it. So while he bears a whole lot of he made the switch, it wasn't Scotty's fault. Scotty was following orders, reluctantly, I might add.
Now, one of the iconic pieces of sports history that Scotty Connell was associated with was the home run that Carlton Fisk hit in the playoffs. And everybody knows what I'm talking about, and even people who aren't sports fans, as he's jumping up and down, coaxing the ball to stay fair. And Scotty Connell locked in on Fisk with that camera and got that shot, but there's more to the story, right?
The real Scotty Connell call was putting the camera inside the Green Monster. Nobody had done that before. He was able to call, stay with Fisk, stay with Fisk, stay with Fisk. He was able to make that call. But if the camera's not there, he doesn't get that shot.
One of the points I love about your book is that you brought home in vivid detail the conditions that you guys were working in the lead up to the actual first broadcast. And as you mentioned already in this interview, the room that you were in. Could you describe the conditions that ESPN or Espionat people had to work in order to get this going?
We grew so fast that summer that we ended up in the attic of that 319 Cook Street, Plainville. It was the United Cable local office that we ended up renting, and it was there that much of the programming and production was planned, but it was executed in Bristol, where we built the studio. And Bill Rasmussen, being who he is, had promised the cable industry that we were going to sign on the air on September 7th. Well, the building wasn't ready. So the Sports Center set got wrapped in plastic, essentially, and we parked a remote truck outside of it, and it became our master control. We were doing business out of trailers, and then when we signed on, as we were prepping to do it, nobody told the bulldozing landscapers that this was happening, and the remote truck actually got bumped by one of the bulldozers, which sent the world into panic, but it didn't tip over. But it was kind of crazy. All the telephones fell off. And anyway, that plastic wrapped studio became the site of our first network full time telecast. I always try and correct that because our actual first telecast occurred on November 17th, 1978. It was a Yukon game that Lou and I produced. It was the first in a series of about 20 telecasts that we used as bait for the cable industry to see that we were in fact real.
You had a chance meeting with Ted Turner, who was starting up the All News Network at about the same time that you're starting up the All Sports Network. Tell us about that meeting.
It was at the 1979 cable television convention in Las Vegas. Turner's booth and our booth was pretty much on the same location. So, rather casually, he was there to promote CNN, which had reserved space on what was going to be the third satellite in the sky. The first one that we were on, the second one was a government military, so nobody could use it. And the third one was yet to be launched. It was due to be launched very soon, and he was building CNN. So we had a casual bet about who was going to get on the air first. And lo and behold, as SATCOM 3 was launched, it got lost in space. So he was a couple of years behind us, actually, before CNN was actually on the air. So I won the bet. In addition to paying up, he sent me a poster that had a picture of him and a big headline that says, "I was in cable before cable was cool." And he autographed it. "So are you, Peter." I still have that.
Let's talk about September 7th, 1979. So like you say, Rasmussen had kind of drawn the line in the sand and said, come hell or high water, we're going to be going live on September 7th. You were not only involved, but you were in the room that evening. What was that like?
It was hard to describe. The tension and the drama was amazing. What was funny about that evening was we had Budweiser as the major advertiser, the exclusive beer advertiser on ESPN for a guaranteed long-term period. And their executives were invited to come up and watch the launch. And after we did our first Sports Center thing, we throw it to our very first live program. And it's the championship game of the slow pitch World Series of softball. And the camera zooms in onto the pitcher who represented the team, the Milwaukee Schlitz, and with the Schlitz logo emblazoned across the chest of his uniform. I thought the salespeople would choke. And the Budweiser people kind of rolled their eyes, but they were pretty good about it.
We've got Lee Leonard and George Grant on the sets. They're the two anchors. And one of them said, if you love sports, if you really love sports, you'll think you've died and gone to sports heaven. Was that scripted?
Yes, it was scripted. That was Lee Leonard. It still has legs. I see ESPN using it in promos today. It was scripted by, there were 3 or 4 people who claimed to have done it. It wasn't me.
You know, you look here at 2025, and this was 1979, and you look at how far ESPN has come. I can't even imagine how proud you must be.
I don't get tired of talking about it. I've had some success doing other things, but not at this level. It's always a topic of conversation when I meet new people.
You sold the rights to your book, right? And there's going to be a movie coming out on this?
I'm not supposed to talk about that. I'm not supposed to say that the producers of Yellowstone and Landman and bought the rights.
that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. You know, ESPN has grown into a behemoth cable franchise with 7 different domestic cable channel offerings, all of which, of course, are owned by Disney. They're going to be celebrating their 50th anniversary in 2029. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Peter Fox, the first executive producer of ESPN and its first employee. He recounts the memories in his book, The Early Days of ESPN, 300 Daydreams and Nightmares. The answer to this week's trivia question: it is the most famous day from the Revolutionary War that we used to celebrate but don't really celebrate anymore. What happened on November 25th? The answer: November 25th, 1783 was Evacuation Day. Well, next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to revisit the significance of this crucial day in the history of the battle for independence. It was the day when the British left the U.S. for the last time, evacuating New York City and starting this new country of ours. Wait until you hear what happened on that day. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.